Hello everybody and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Minolta X-700. I do have also, if you learn better by reading, a book out on this camera. Here's what the cover looks like, and here are some of the graphics, some images of some of the graphics that are inside so you can see how the information is presented. It's a perfect size for just tossing in your camera case or as a companion to this video if you want to pick up some other things as well. So at any rate, there's that as an option. This is a 35mm interchangeable lens camera. What does that mean? 35mm means it can take any 35mm film and it will be able to take photos on it. Interchangeable lens means that you can take the lens off and put another one on at any time. And in video 2, we'll see a lot more about the film and the lenses as well. Single lens reflex means there is a single lens on the camera. The light passes through it, goes to a reflex mirror up into the pentaprism here, and then you can see what the lens is seeing through the viewfinder. This has a center weighted through the lens meter. What that means is that the light going through the lens is what informs the meter reading to give you a proper exposure, and center weighted, that's the through the lens part by the way, center weighted means that it takes the area in the center of the image, about like I'm drawing the circle here, and that's the majority of the metering information, and then the balance comes from everything outside of that center area. So that makes this really good for center framing subjects, or if you want to meter and then recompose, for obtaining accurate meter readings off of that metered subject before you recompose. We're going to talk about that in the second video as well. The shutter speeds are stepless in automatic mode and program mode, and they have a range of 4 seconds to 1/1000th, and you can also go to an extra second faster you can go up to 1 second in manual shooting. What does stepless mean? Well, if we take a look at the top of the camera here, we can see the shutter speeds, 1 second to 1/1000th. Each time we move up, we're moving up a step, also called a stop. They're somewhat interchangeable terms, but basically you're going 1 to 2 is one step, 2 to 4 is another step. In program and also in automatic mode like this, stepless means that if the camera needs a shutter speed of 1/433rd, it will give you a shutter speed of 1/433rd. It's not locked into these fixed stops like you are when you shoot manual. The camera has a viewfinder with 0.9x magnification and 95% frame coverage. What does that mean? Let's assume that what you're looking at right now is what's going to be on the negative after you take a photo. That means that what is in the viewfinder would be 90% of the size of all of this, and that about 2.5% on each of the sides and top and bottom would be on your negative, but not in your viewfinder. And to show you what that means, here's a graphic that takes a photo through this camera's viewfinder and also of this shutter area with a piece of frosted plastic on it to focus the image, so that you can see what the exact same thing looks like through the viewfinder and through the camera's shutter curtains. The camera has interchangeable focusing screens. The focusing screen is right in here underneath, and in the second video I'll show you how to change that, but there are 8 options for focusing screens with this camera. The flash sync speed on this camera as well, up here on the top, is 1/60th of a second. One key feature that the Minolta X-700 offers that was unique among the Minolta X lineup, I don't think the 600 had it, but of the common ones, 300, 500, and 700, this is the only one that had it, and was program mode. Okay, all of the other Minolta X cameras had aperture-priority, well, the later ones, the 300, 500, 600, and 700 had aperture priority mode. This is the one that had program. We'll talk about how to use this mode in the second video in detail. In short, in order to use program mode, you must have a lens that has a green aperture on it and a switch that will reveal a green index when you push it toward the camera body. That's mandatory for program mode. If you don't need program mode, then you might actually find the X500 or 570, depending on what part of the world you're in, more to your liking, as it's basically this camera without program mode. So there are a couple of known problems with the X700, and they're generally pretty easy to fix. The first one is the capacitor, and this is true of all of the X cameras, is I think right under here inside the camera. If you have one of these And when you take a picture, the mirror gets stuck halfway up, or you know you've got good batteries in there and there's no response from the shutter button, then your capacitor may have failed. And the only way to fix that is to remove the old capacitor by unsoldering it and solder in a replacement. It takes about 15 minutes if you've never done anything like that before. All you need is a soldering iron and some other basic tools. And there are some really good videos online you can find that show how to do that. It's pretty simple. I've done it a couple dozen times, and it's once you've done it once, after that it gets even easier. The other problem these are sometimes known for having, and this is more uncommon thankfully, is that the shutter curtain here can sometimes hop the advanced track. Basically these curtains, the way that they work is that they're like a rectangle of black fabric, and then coming off of them they have these strips that connect to rollers that pull them through the camera and then pull them to reset as well. If those little strips fall off of a roller, then the shutter curtain can be jammed. And one of the ways that manifests is that the curtain will only move halfway and then it won't move at all. You can't get it to budge. Or if the front of one of the curtains is kind of at an angle and it doesn't want to move, that's another indication of that. Also, if the curtains don't move, even if you replace the capacitor, because that seems like that might be a thing that needed to be done if the curtains weren't working, replacing the capacitor, curtains still don't move, that can indicate that there's a problem with the curtains as well. The Minolta X-700 was aimed at the advanced consumer or the professional photographer. It is honestly one of only a handful of cameras over the course of camera history that was successfully marketed to basically all users. And by and large, anybody who has used the X700 likes it. I do like the X700 a lot. I prefer the 570 simply because I don't ever use program mode, but the X700 is a lovely, lovely camera to use. So I've not met anyone who has a working 700 who dislikes it. The program mode feature in this camera was friendly for new users who wanted to just learn kind of the camera layout, and also the rest of the functions were very professional oriented, and this was a really good balance of both cameras, both markets and what they want in different cameras. It was made by the Minolta Camera Company in Japan first, then Malaysia, and then China. It was produced all told from 1980 until 1999, so an incredibly long production run for this. I could not find exactly what years it was produced in each location. However, the Maxim cameras were by and large made in Malaysia, and those debuted in 1985. So we can assume that in the mid-80s at the latest, probably in the 84 to 85 range, then these were being transitioned to production in Malaysia. The production line, as I understand it, in Malaysia was then transferred over to the Seagull factory in China in 1990. So there is a bit of a debate as to which ones are best. Generally, if you have a made in China one, those do tend to have, as a matter of reported, I don't have hard data on this, I have heard more people say that those have a higher rate of the capacitors failing than do the made in Malaysia ones and the made in Japan ones, although the made in Japan ones are oldest, so they do have their own issues with capacitors. So anyway, just a fun thing to know. This one doesn't, does this one, oh yeah, hey, this one was made in Japan. This is how you can tell it was made in Japan. The QC sticker there, that was only applied for the made in Japan bodies. This was preceded by the XGM, and it was followed by nothing directly, as it was the last of the manual focus cameras. And by the time this came out, there wasn't, I mean, there were other Maxim cameras that kind of did the same thing, but those were so electronically controlled and had so many features that there wasn't a Maxim that I'm aware of that directly lines up with the features of this, although the tier that this was marketed toward would probably have been closest to the Maxim 7. Now, if you have your Minolta X-700, we're going to go over all of the features on the camera, and we'll start here, as we do, with the camera's top. Technically on the front, strap lugs with split rings. Here we have the film rewind knob and dial. Basically, you can use this to rewind your film. You can also use it to open up the back of the camera by lifting it up. Around it, we have this ring that is not going to move for me right now, and that's okay. This is the exposure value compensation ring. If we push the exposure value compensation ring lock release down, now we can adjust the exposure value compensation. I'll show you how this works in video too. Generally speaking, you want to leave this in 0 have the 0 lined up with the index here, and that's going to give you a proper exposure. Oh, here it is. On the back of that wheel right there, you can see there's a film ISO indicator, and if you lift this knob and rotate it, then you can adjust the film speed that you're using when you load the film. Again, we'll talk about that more in the second video. Flash hot shoe, serial number, shutter speed index, shutter speed and mode dial, P for program, A for automatic. This is your program automatic mode lock release. Push it down, and now we can move the dial out of program mode or automatic. With this button not pushed down, this is locked into place in program mode and automatic. In manual mode, you can move it freely, but as soon as you get back to one of the automatic modes, it clicks into place, just like that. Now, the reason that is when you're in manual mode, you're going to be shifting the shutter speed on your own to get a proper meter reading. In automatic mode, which is aperture priority, you set the shutter aperture on the lens, and the camera will automatically pick the best shutter speed for you. In program mode, you set this here, and then you lock the lens at f22, slide that button towards the camera, and now the camera will pick the best shutter speed and aperture for you. There is no shutter priority mode on this camera. I don't know if they left it off just because, or if it's outside of the technical capabilities, but I guess realistically there's no reason. It seems like you should be able to just lock this at this aperture and then pick a shutter speed and have it automatically pick the aperture setting. You cannot actually do that. This will not work. Okay, behind here you can see it says off. That is your power switch. This is the switch up here to adjust it, and we're going to switch it to on or on with beep. Did I get those right? I did. Okay, so basically off is in the middle, and then on or on with beep, whichever one you prefer. This is your film loading correctness indicator. This will indicate that your film has been loaded correctly and that it's moving through the camera correctly. Frame count window to let you know how many photos you've taken on your roll, and film advance lever right here so that you can advance the film. And then behind it, you have a little symbol right there. That is your film plane indicator, and lets you know where the film plane is at if you need to make extremely critical film plane to subject distance calculations for things like macro photography. We have a handful of things on the front of the camera we're going to talk about. First, this little button right here is a combination auto exposure lock and self timer button. We'll talk about the auto exposure lock function in the second video, which you access by pushing this down. But if you lift it up so you can see that little orange index, it activates the self timer. Little light here will indicate the self timer is counting down, and then after the 10 seconds, there you go. If we switch over to on with beep, let's see what happens. Oh, it beeps. So the on with beep will give you an audio warning about exposures and also give you a beep when the self timer is counting down. Then here we have this little index right here is used by the camera to connect with the lens to know when it's in program mode. This ring around the lens flange here, this ring is your aperture linkage. So basically when you mount the lens on the camera, there is this little tab right here on the aperture ring, and as you adjust this aperture ring, that tab moves as the ring is adjusted. That ring interacts with this connection to tell the camera what aperture the ring is set to, which is why when you have the lens on the camera, the aperture will be open instead of closed. But if you take even when you're taking a light meter reading, but if you take the lens off and shut the aperture down, a correctly working lens will have the aperture close. This is the lens mounting index. This is what we'll use to mount lenses in the second video. Here we have a flash PC socket, so you can plug a flash into your camera and have it off the camera. We'll talk about that in the second video. This is your lens release button. We'll see in the second video how this is used to release your lens. This is your cable socket. So if you want to use a cable to trigger your camera, you can do that. It just screws in here. It's all a standard thread for all of them. One of the nice things about this is if you are doing, let's say, that macro photo where you have taken a measurement and you calculated your exposure or whatever, you don't want to have any image shake in that macro photo because macro lenses are very sensitive to that. You can set your shutter speed to however many seconds you need it to be or however long, because macro photos also take a lot of light. And here you can push you can put a cable in here, and then when you're standing a foot or next to your tripod or whatever, push a button that triggers your shutter and let go of it if you're in bulb mode to end your exposure. So this basically works exactly like your shutter button. It's just you screw a cable into it. Here we have the depth of field preview, and if I push it in, you might be able to see there's a little lever in the bottom there that engages as I push it in. I'll show you what that does when I mount this lens right here. I'm going to set this to f11 and watch the aperture in the lens. There you go. As I close down the depth of field preview lever, the aperture closes. So that is something you can use when you're taking photos to get an idea of what's going to be in focus when you take your actual photo. Camera's back doesn't have too much, but here we have an ISO ASA conversion table. Back when this came out, the DIN and ASA were still separate standards. ISO was maybe taking them over right about that time, but ISO took over the standards governing film. So now when you see film in ISO, it will say 12 degrees, 12 ISO, or 21 degrees, 100. Back then it didn't. ISO and ASA use the exact same number. So if you have a 400 ISO film, you're setting your ASA dial up here to 400 ASA. When you take your film out of the box it's in, you can tear that tab off of the box, right, like that. Just slide it in here, and then you'll know what kind of film you have loaded and how many frames. And then here's your viewfinder eyepiece. The bottom of the camera has a number of different things to look at. We're going to start here with these electronic contacts for the motor drive. Over here with this mechanical coupling for the motor drive. If you have a motor drive, this is what allows it to do its thing. If you don't have one, honestly, don't go out of your way. It's like a 1.5 or 2 frames per second, not very fast, and it adds a lot of weight. So not a huge use for it anymore. Battery chamber, tripod socket, film release button right here. And we'll talk about these things in the second video. To get inside of the camera, all we have to do is lift up on the film rewind knob, and then once we get far enough, it will just simply pop open like that. Number of different things inside of the camera that are meant to help you get good images. This is the film cassette chamber right here. When you put in your film cassette, the forks in this post connect to it, and then the cassette sits right here, and we'll see that in the second video. This is a film guide pin that helps the film come out of the cassette in the correct orientation. These 4 silver rails are your film guide rails. These 2 inner ones work with the film pressure plate, we'll talk about in a second, to keep your film flat as it's inside of the camera. The ones on the top and bottom that look like dots or hyphens, they keep your film properly oriented so it stays like this going through the camera instead of shifting and getting jammed or something like that. So all of that helps keep your film moving smoothly. Between the film guide rails we have the shutter curtains, and those are the things that open and close when you take your photo to give you an image. These 3 dots here are for your data back, and if you have one, honestly I'm pretty sure that on these cameras the dates are no longer valid. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the case. But if you have a data back, this is what connects to it with your camera to tell the data back when to trigger the light inside of it to imprint the date information onto the film. Here we have the film advance, the film take-up sprocket, and film take-up spool and film advance sprocket. And when you advance the film, these spin. This takes up the film, and this spins to keep the film moving through the camera, because the sprocket holes on the film pair up with the sprocket inside the camera. One thing about the film advance sprocket is it cannot move backwards, okay? So you can see I'm pushing on it and it's not going backwards. If I push the film rewind release button on the bottom, now it can move backwards. So when you're taking photos, this sprocket right here is designed to help ensure that your film only moves this way and doesn't accidentally move backwards. Also right here we have a film door release, and if you slide down on this little release like that, you can take the film door off of your camera. On the back of the camera we have this little shape here, this little guide that nests up against the film advance sprocket to help ensure that the film sprocket holes engage with the sprocket. And here you can see how the film pressure plate aligns with this area to keep the film flat, and then this little spring or shape here keeps the film cassette properly aligned inside of the camera so that the film advances and goes back onto it smoothly. To remount the back of the camera, all you have to do is angle lower pin into the camera, release down towards the bottom of the post or hinge, whatever you want to call it, and then release that when it's properly aligned. And now you've reattached the film back. So I do have some tips for you on using this camera to help you be better at it very quickly. The first is that this has a center weighted meter, and we talked about what that means is that if you center compose your images, if you take pictures of people and you put their face in the middle, that will give you a good exposure off of their face. Center weighted meters are also really good for general shooting, but that's a thing you can do. The other is that when we talk about the auto exposure lock in the second video, and I show you how to use that, if you have a subject over here who's in shade and a really bright area over here, you can walk up to them, take a meter reading off of them with them in the majority of the center of the frame, use your auto exposure lock to remember the exposure settings. This, by the way, only applies to program and aperture priority mode. And then walk back over to where you wanted to take the picture, put the subject in the shade over here and then the beach or whatever over here. And as long as you hold this down, your camera will continue to remember those settings. So with auto exposure lock in aperture priority or program mode, you can use this to trick your camera into using exposure settings it wouldn't if it metered a high contrast scene at the time it took the photo. Next thing is you can also use the exposure value compensation instead. If you don't want to use AEL lock, or you can't get over to take a close-up meter reading, you can just intentionally overexpose by up to 2 stops if you're trying to get something in the shade to be very well exposed, or underexpose by up to 2 stops if you're trying to get something that's in bright sun, for instance, to be very well exposed. So, and you in both of those settings have a very high contrast scene. This has a couple of other uses, and we'll talk about another one in the second part, at the end of the second video. But basically what this does is this is designed to, in automatic and program mode, cause your camera to intentionally overexpose or underexpose your images by up to 2 stops. Basically, it's the same as going from 1/30th of a second, 1/60th is a stop, 1/125th is a stop, 30th to 1/15th is a stop, and a 30th to 1/8th is a second stop. That's the relationship on the shutter speed dial to the numbers on this dial. My last tip is going to be, if you just got this camera, especially if you're new to film photography, use program mode the first few rolls and learn how the camera interface works, how it handles. And once you've gotten those back and you can see that it's delivering good images for you, then try manual mode and try automatic mode. Program is really got its best use for people who are just casual photographers. Honestly, they're not getting film cameras anymore, and also for learning a new camera. So those are the tips I've got for you on this. And lastly, some things not to do with your camera. Don't store it with the shutter ready to fire. When you're done for the day, trigger the shutter, because there are some springs in there, and you put them under tension when you advance the film. And if you don't let the tension off of them, you can fatigue them and damage them over time or affect your camera's shutter timing. Next is, don't touch the shutter curtains in here, because that's a really good way to cause your shutter curtains to jam or skip their track or otherwise be damaged. Also, don't touch the mirror behind the lens, because your finger oils can tarnish that mirror, and because your light meter is in the prism, that can affect your meter quality and accuracy, and also your ability to focus. Don't leave your camera or lenses in your car. Heat and cold are very, very hard on these. Very hot car weather can cause the lenses in the apertures in the lenses to get oily, and then that oil gets on the leaves, and then the aperture doesn't work properly. Likewise, same thing with the lubricating oils in the camera's body. Also, extreme cold can have some really big problems for the plastics in the camera's body. Don't let your X-700 get wet. It's not weather sealed. Water, even a rain, can cause a short in your camera that will ruin it. And lastly, just remember that your Minolta X-700 is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. As long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So now, if you've learned from this video and you want to see all of the in-depth operational aspects of this camera, click on this link and it'll take you to the second part of this series.